Newcomb says gunshot residue tests weren't performed on Commissioner Nodine when he was questioned Sunday night.
Newcomb said the test isn't done in Alabama because it's unreliable. But forensic scientists beg to differ.
Fox 10 News reporter John Rogers joining us live in the studio with more on that. John?
Bob Linnies has spent the day at the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. An official there says the test can be reliable in determining if someone fired a weapon. He says after a gun is fired, microscopic particles escape from the gun and stick to the shooter's hand. The official says the main problem with the test is that the particles can easily fall off.
It's pretty obvious when someone shoots a gun. But in some crime scenes, figuring out who fired a gun is not always obvious. Forensic scientists have tools to help, like a gunshot residue test.
Forensic scientists say after a gun is fired, the residue spreads to the shooter's hand.
It's called primer residue. It's made up of microscopic chemical particles.
The primer residues that would be deposited on the hands can be used for an investigative lead. So if somebody has those primer residues on their hands, they may have some questions to answer. It tells you four things. Basically, one would be if a shooter fired a gun, or if they were in the general vicinity of a gun being fired, or if they picked up a gun that had recently been fired. And the last is it could be contamination from, say, if they had gotten in the back of a police car or something like that.
McSpadden says investigators conduct the test by taking a swab of the person's hand and placing it under a special microscope. He says the residue wears off in 3 hours. Baldwin County District Attorney Judy Newcomb says the tests are not performed in Alabama because they're unreliable.
But the test that y'all keep asking about is not what's being done. But I can assure you there are lots of things that are being done, and that's what we want to concentrate on.
The test itself is not unreliable.
But McSpadden says there are some key problems with it. The residue can quickly wear off after washing your hands or by just walking around. So even if a person fired a weapon, the test could come out negative.
If you get a negative test back, then it can be conceived that the person didn't fire a gun, but it doesn't answer that question, and we want to definitively answer the question.
Sometimes a gunshot residue test can be reliable, but other times it's seen as a shot in the dark.
A law enforcement official says in cases like these, fingerprints on shell casings are accurate tests to determine who fired a gun. McSpadden tells me gunshot residue tests used to be done in Alabama until about 20 years ago. He says other states in the country still use it. The forensics official says it's not against the law to use the test. He says investigators can still take a swab from a suspect and send it into a private lab for testing.